Something that I've talked about a lot on this channel is Big Finish's impact on the Sixth Doctor, and I have the possibly controversial opinion that not only is his TV era much better than people give it credit for, but I'd say Big Finish is less about fixing his era and more about finishing the arc that he never got to complete in the TV series, as given how Trial of a Time Lord ends, and the main arc of that season, it's really deep diving into his character and his flaws, and the series ends with him going on the journey to start bettering himself. Sadly, we never get to see that in the show, but thankfully Big Finish finished that arc, and therefore completed the Sixth Doctor's story in its entirety. However, that being said, something I realise now is jumping from one medium to another in order to complete a character arc isn't exactly the most practical method of storytelling. It's not impossible, but I can see some people not being all that interested in following up on this arc, especially if they aren't used to the audio medium. Therefore, as an interesting experiment, I've decided to theorise on what the 60th anniversary might have been like if it was relatively the same sort of story, but instead of David Tennant as the Doctor, it's instead focused on Colin Baker. Generally speaking, the story is relatively the same. Basically, a previous incarnation of the Doctor somehow is brought back to life at the end of Power of the Doctor. Confused, they end up reuniting with their past companion and end up having to figure out why they've turned back into this old incarnation, and ultimately by the end accepts their fate and allows Ncuti Gatwa to become the new Doctor. I'd also include some elements that are very set in stone, like Neil Patrick Harris is still playing the Toymaker, or at least the villain. We'll have some references to expanded media and even an adaptation of an expanded media story. I'll go into more detail about that in a second, as well as Ncuti having a minor subplot throughout the story, basically surviving wherever Neil Patrick Harris sent him. But before we get into the details, I'd just like to ask, if you haven't already, please support the channel by hitting subscribe, turning on notifications, liking, commenting. You can find and follow me on social media at the links here, and without further ado, let's get into it. So, part 1 of the 60th anniversary would see the newly regenerated 14th/6th Doctor arriving on Earth in the relative present and reuniting with Perry, once again played by Nicola Bryant, and King Yrcanos, played by Brian Blessed. This story would be sort of a remake of the New Adventures story Bad Therapy, which tackles the idea of the Doctor reuniting with Perry following the events of Mind Warp, and having her not be happy with the situation she was left in, with the relationship with Yrcanos really not working out. However, the story is then shifted when a group of mercenaries led by Syl, once again played by Nabil Shaban, end up attacking Earth, seeking revenge for the Doctor's actions against Syl. However, it turns out one of the mercenaries is in fact an undercover Time Lord working with the CIA. I was thinking about maybe having it be someone from the Division to sort of tie it into Series 13, but I didn't really think it would work timeline and continuity wise. And it turns out they're not hunting the Doctor, they're in fact hunting Perry. So slight spoilers for Perry and the Piscon Paradox, but that story really dives into the official explanation as to what happened to Perry following the events of Mind Warp, whether or not she died, whether or not she lived. And the ultimate explanation is both happened. The Time Lords created multiple different timelines for Perry, which led to at least 5 of them existing and 5 different versions of Perry wandering about in the universe.
It was a very chaotic time on Gallifrey. Perry was taken out of time not once, but several times. Just as when we engineered the meeting of your other selves.
The doctor slaps his forehead.
Oh. And every botch retrieval created its own separate time stream. Hence no temporal shorting when the Perrys came into contact.
He turns to me.
Perry, I am so sorry. My people have messed about with your life. To think that due to skullduggery and cowardice from my own kin, there are now 2 Perrys in existence.
5, actually. At the last count, anyway.
Says the man, lamely.
5? 5 Perrys? 5? I don't believe it. How on Gallifrey can they make such a monumental cock-up with the Continuum?
For the longest time, I've really wanted to see a story that tackles the whole concept of there being 5 Perrys and having them all meet up. So I've decided to adapt that concept into a live-action format and retool it slightly to make it more suitable to general audiences who haven't necessarily heard the Big Finish library, but doesn't retcon it at the same time. The ultimate purpose of this story would be to offer a live-action finale for the 6th Doctor and Perry's arc, and finally give the audience peace in regards to their relationship, the two of them finally making amends after all of the stuff that happened during his TV run. I'd very much think it'd be interesting to dive into that. Having the story be partially set from the perspective of this version of Perry, who isn't familiar with all the character growth 6 goes through, it helps to allow all that information that the Doctor is aware of be exposited in a more natural way, since she isn't familiar with all that stuff, and all of the adventures he had with Perry after the events of Trial of a Time Lord were with one of the alternative versions, not this specific one. The reason Perry is being hunted by this Time Lord is the fact that the prospect of having 5 different versions of the same person existing across time is causing serious damage, and therefore the CIA decided that the best course of action was to hunt down and eliminate the 4 that are still alive, leaving the official timeline be the one where she did die. Yukanos ends up sacrificing himself, so this doesn't happen immediately, and the Doctor takes Perry away off in the TARDIS, which would lead into part 2, which would mostly be about the Doctor tracking down all the different versions of Perry in order to save them from the same fate. This would include the version of the character that ended up travelling with the Doctor again in stuff like The Widow's Assassin, and the one we see in that Blu-ray collection DVD trailer. We got the one who has a job as a TV personality in LA, and I think with that sequence I'd sneak in a Whoopi Goldberg cameo, given that she's been very interested in appearing in Doctor Who. And finally you'd have the last living Perry, that being the one that actually managed to make things work with Yukanos and ended up having a relatively happy life and starting a family with him. The final part would see the Toymaker revealing himself and basically being the one pulling the strings from the background. We'd see him throughout the story as a minor recurring element, but part 3 is where he really dives into what his plan is, basically revealing that he captured that Time Lord agent, accounting for the fact why he isn't aware of the Time War and the destruction of Gallifrey / its disappearance, whatever, and engineered a situation where at first he offers the Doctor a compromise, an opportunity to return to his old life with Perry without the mistakes he made beforehand. The Doctor is somewhat tempted but naturally refuses and is prepared to move forward and embrace his new incarnation. So the Toymaker offers an additional incentive, that being if he doesn't agree to basically become his toy, then Perry will die. By agreeing to the plan, not only will he stay as the Sixth Doctor, but Perry gets to live. But if he doesn't, Perry will cease to exist and he'll be forced to watch her die 5 times. This makes it a bit more tempting for the Doctor to agree because of the desperate situation, even though giving up his freedom basically dooms the universe, so he's caught between saving Perry and saving the universe. But Perry is ultimately the one who makes the decision and decides to accept her fate. I'm kind of torn on how the story ends, whether or not all of the Perrys do end up dying, or they all combine into one, and the Perry who ended up leaving a happy life with Yakanos is the one who ends up surviving, but decides that she needs to lead a more quiet life in order to avoid not only the Time Lords, but also messing up history any more than she already has. The story would end with the two finally making peace with each other, and then, of course, Colin would regenerate into Ncuti. Out of all the Doctors, I'd say Colin is the one who'd most deserve this type of story, getting one last hurrah and a finale that satisfies both fans of Big Finish and those who've only watched his TV content. I'd throw in a couple of additional references to Big Finish. Much like David Tennant's getting, Colin would have an alternative version of his costume, including the blue coat that Colin wears in his audio dramas, but also maybe throw in some meta jokes like the Doctor loosely remembering the events of Big Finish but can't quite see the pictures in his mind, but he can hear the voices of the people he travelled with because it's an audio format. This was just sort of like a fun little experiment to theorise what could have been for the 60th anniversary. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think of this idea in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.